Well, I think we'll make a start, everybody. Welcome to this event, which of course has been postponed 3 times because of COVID, and I'm absolutely delighted that we've managed to get this off the ground this time before we possibly go back into lockdown over Christmas. Who knows what's going to happen. So I think we've just snuck this in just at the right time. And I just want to acknowledge the support. I was just talking to our head of school there, Kenneth Hamilton. Just want to acknowledge his support as well. And also the support of QBrit, which is a newly established research centre here at the School of Music, which was only established in September of this year. And so, unfortunately, my co-director of that research unit is not very well today, David Beard. So David will not be able to make it today, which is very, very unfortunate. So the title of this conference is Unmasking Max. And indeed, masks and mask play feature prominently in the work of Peter Maxwell Davies. For instance, in the operas Taverner and Resurrection, in the song cycle The Blind Fiddler, and even in the Strathclyde Concerto No. 6. Writing to the composer Gerald McBurney in 1991, Max characterised in his music theatre work Blind Man's Buff as a work about identity crises expressed through mask imagery, adding later that he enjoys wearing masks. You can make otherwise impossible statements behind a mask. So from this quotation, we can discern that on one level, the use of masks involved issues closely associated with personal identity. This manifests itself in the music, for instance, through multiple musical references, alphabet codes, autobiographical allusions, and other symbolic devices or masquerades, such as the emblematic use of magic squares and the so-called death chord music cipher. More obviously, the use of masks concerns the notion of diverse stylistic masks. And Max was a stylistic shapeshifter with the ability to negotiate stylistic categories and boundaries, sometimes within the same work. And in that same letter to McBurney, he addressed the topic of different stylistic levels. And I quote Max here, "The very existence of different types of music in my output from 1949 on is influenced by the medieval concept of divine and mundane music. Originally, if you like, up there, the music of the spheres, and as earthly and everyday experience is approached, descending towards ordinary music." So this afternoon's panel discussion will remember Max and discuss his legacy. I'll be asking the panel members to unmask Max if they possibly can, and consider, through their own experiences and memories, the following question. Who was the real Peter Maxwell Davies? So, may I extend a warm welcome to you all once again. There are other people who will be coming to the study day who have registered. They'll be coming later on, because some people will be coming from quite a distance this morning, so they won't be here until the lunchtime concert. So there'll be other colleagues and friends later on. But in the meantime, I'd like to welcome Rodney, who is going to kick off things, and I'd welcome my good friend and colleague, Richard McGregor, who is going to chair this opening session. So over to you, you two, please.
Also to welcome Rodney. Rodney and I have never actually met. We've corresponded numerous times on various aspects of Max's music. I believe you studied with Max for a while in the mid-70s.
Yes.
You're based in Boston and teaches composition and all the other things that one does. And it's, without any further ado, I'd just like to hand over to Rodney to give us his paper.
Thank you. So, I have to say, I'm reading the abstract. I was very impressed. I've been lately kind of under the gun to get this done, and I was scrambling, and then 2 or 3 days ago, my laptop had a near-death experience. So this is going to be a kind of combination of scripted and unscripted, and I hope it will kind of flow in the end into a discussion. So here we go. So in 1969, let's see. Not that this is a 1969 picture, but in 1969, the year in which he wrote 8 songs for Mad King and for Vasily Iconis and finished World Bliss, Max wrote St. Thomas Wake. He was 35 years old. The work, which was commissioned by the city of Dormant, subtitled Foxtrot for Orchestra, is for a foxtrot band and a big bad orchestra. The foxtrot band plays foxtrots and the big bad orchestra plays big bad modernist orchestra music, both of which musics are derived from the Pavan by John Bull, entitled St. Thomas Wake. Max was emphatic that despite the difference in style of these two musics, they were based on the same material, with the two bands commenting on each other's music and projecting the material through a series of mathematical curves. The binding factor for all of this being the music by Bull, which at the end of the piece makes an appearance simultaneously with one of the last foxtrots, which has exactly the same harmonic skeleton. St. Thomas Wake was perhaps the biggest manifestation of Max's obsession, for the lack of a better word, with foxtrots, with the possible exception of the music for Ken Russell's film of The Boyfriend. Other examples can be found in 8 songs, Vasily Iconis, and the arrangements and orchestrations of Purcell Pavans. He often spoke of his experience as a child in the Second World War, playing records of foxtrots on a wind-up gramophone during air raids, and St. Thomas Wake is probably the work that most completely and strikingly memorializes that experience. In fact, in his interview with Sue Lawley on the BBC Desert Island Disc on January 30, 2005, he seemed to say that the composition of St. Thomas Wake was the means by which he recovered the memory. The quote is, "It was only when I was coming to the end of writing it I remembered the whole experience of the cubbyhole under the stairs and thought, that is what I'm touching here." Stephen Prusslin, in Tempo in March of 1978, writing an introduction to the First Symphony, posited St. Thomas Wake as the scherzo of a hyper-symphony, consisting of important orchestral pieces from Max's from the 1960s, following up from the Second Tavener Fantasia, which he considered a symphony in everything but the name. The first movement of the hyper-symphony was World's Bliss, and the slow movement following St. Thomas Wake was Stone Litany. The finale was the newly written symphony, even though it had 4 movements, at that point without a number, and apparently at that time without any plans for subsequent ones. Flash forward to 2012. The 78-year-old Max wrote his 9th symphony, which was dedicated to the Queen in celebration of her Diamond Jubilee. I saw Max sometime during the time he was working on its composition, and I asked him if he was experiencing 9th Symphony syndrome. He replied no and said that 15 was the new 9. This work, which is also for a large orchestra and a smaller contrasting ensemble, in this case a brass sextet, which also plays different and contrasting music. Here, let's see, I'm missing something in the sentence. Here is sort of British military music. In his presentation of this work, Max was emphatic that the music of the two groups was completely unrelated. He evoked the Roman Basilica of Santa Maria del Popolo, saying that the work was the musical equivalent of a central nave with side chapels, where the nave is of one consistent style and the chapels have other styles, often a clashing later period, yet still maintaining, because of symmetrical relationships, some kind of strained unity. The use of the brass sextet in the music it plays evokes British military music, although he was careful to say that in doing so he intended no disrespect for military music or bands as such, or for that matter presumably for the Queen, which as master of the Queen's music I have come to know well and love. Rather, it was his witness of protest for the British participation in the Iraq War. In his program note for the symphony, he added, let's see, I've got to find where I am now. Having been bombed in the 1941 Blitz and witnessed people on fire and running up the street, and having seen bodies dug out of the rubble, I feel that such treatment should not be unleashed on any population without the most compelling reasons. and thus evoked, without naming the piece, the events of his life which St. Thomas Weiss memorializes. St. Thomas Weiss begins with the Foxtrot band warming up, playing a sort of a skeleton of the bull Pavan, or as Max put it, already in the process of transformation into a slow foxtrot. Just as the music begins to coalesce, the orchestra enters, playing the, as it were, real music. The music they play has 4 sections, the first characterized by repeating percussion patterns, the second by sustained sonorities with increasingly agitated swirling solo woodwind lines, and with ever-increasing range, the third with continuous double bass pizzicato notes, the fourth with very long notes which gradually congeal into the Tavener death chord, which I'm guessing everybody here knows what that is. Yes? Okay. You two can correct me about this. It's a chord which it shows up first in the seven in nomenes. Is that right?
Yeah. Okay.
And well, it also is in the opera Tavener, and it's related to I guess the jester in Tavener, and eventually to death. And it's a very interesting chord. In that it's 2 major thirds, D, F sharp, and G sharp, which you may notice is a whole tetrachord. And it once again had quite a lot of symbolism for Max, and I think actually is always with those notes. Is that right? No?
Your article on this.
Sorry.
I've written about that.
Oh.
Now you always get the D and the E, you get them with major and minor thirds, and you get them with double and the
Oh, okay. Well, I stand corrected.
Sorry.
Yes. But actually, the prototypical one is the,
That's the prototypical one.
yes, and that's the one that actually is in St. Thomas Wake.
So in St. Thomas Wake, you always get that A, E flat,
Yes. Okay, let's see. Where are we now? Okay, so the fourth with the very long notes gradually congeals into the Tavener death chord just as the band launches into a foxtrot. The band plays 4 foxtrots. The first in C major, which is 17 bars long in 2/4, and 16 bars in 6/16. In A major, which is 24 bars at 2/4. In B flat minor, in 4/8 for 16 bars. Then a middle section of B flat major for 14 bars, and then returning to B flat minor for 8 bars. In E major, 32 bars of 12/16. In D major, 15 bars of 12/16. And interestingly enough, the D major one, the last one, also puts in appearance in 8 songs. I was trying to figure out if that meant that there was some kind of relationship between Comfort E and the bull, but I'm not. I couldn't find one, but I couldn't find a lot of things. So maybe there is. But at any rate, it shows up. The fifth foxtrot is followed by a fifth section of orchestra music containing elements of the earlier 4 sections, becoming increasingly active and agitated. At the height of this agitation, the band plays a sixth foxtrot, some bars of which are alternated with the solo harp playing bars of what the score says is the original of the bull. Eventually, the harp part is superimposed over the foxtrot, and the orchestra re-enters, playing mostly perpetual repeated strings and very fast notes. This convergence of all the strands of the work is concluded with a final, very loud and sustained series of chords, once again congealing into the death chord, over which the piano of the band plays the last reminiscence of Foxtrot's past. The Ninth Symphony is in one movement with 2 distinct sections, probably most clearly articulated by tempo, the second one being noticeably slower. The first part, which Max identified as having the ghost of a sonata form, has sections which are clearly articulated, and although the function of each structurally is more ambiguous, making it, for this listener anyway, not so clear as to which section might be the exposition, first or second theme, or development. Towards the end of the first part, there are 3 marches which feature the brass sextet, and which presumably we are not supposed to hear as part of this sonata form discourse, although following the notion that they are the side chapels off a central nave, one assumes that the music which the orchestra plays surrounding them are part of that argument. There is also, later than the marches, a section which seems to be an invocation, as mentioned by Max in his program note of the symphony, of the Haydn String Quartet Opus 64, number 2, marked Comma Menuetto. Since the music is not a quotation, it's not so clear. There's some further ambiguity since Max's program notes actually refer to the slow finale of the quartet, which is not the minuet. The texture of this section resembles neither of those movements. From this point, there's a quick alternation of slow and fast music of different characters, finally ending with slow concluding chords, which coalesce into the death chord almost at the very end. Considering that Max's suspicion of sonata form was largely concerned with the question of recapitulation, he couldn't reconcile himself to the repetition it involved. It is perhaps surprisingly that the Ninth Symphony does feature a recapitulation between letters E2 and H2 of the score of the music between letters B and H. In fact, in the short score, the pages for these places are simply double numbered. So it says page 3 and 4 are also pages 44 and 45. The sketch material for St. Thomas Wake is in the British Library. These include sorry, pages are the wrong order. These conclude calculations of various sort. We have another. As well as various sketches involving notes. And I have to admit that mostly I've not had any success in connecting much of these with the final score of the piece. On the pages, one of the pages is clearly a schematic, here we are, of at least the initial plan for the layout of the piece and bears more than a little resemblance to the final version. I haven't been able to connect the notes and numbers of the sketches, or at least much of them, to the score. There's one exception. This begins with a pyramid whose note sequence has appeared in various sketches with different arrangements of numbers. Let's see. And the numbers are always the same, but he changes the. In other words, one of them will be that he keeps shifting them around. Let's see. Okay. So meanwhile, back to this particular one. This begins with the pyramid whose number sequence. Okay, this one sequence, however, has beneath the pyramid a sequence of numbers and note names that corresponds to bars 31 to 62 in the score. These notes are embedded in the texture and are not at all clear, but they are there, at least in this one short section. And then these are the various. These are the. It's one page. These are various kind of photos of them. And this is I've Xeroxed the score and cut it out and tried to paste it together. Unfortunately, the spacing is not quite the same. And by the time the colors are not so clear, but you can see that there are notes and numbers that correspond to one of these notes and to the durations. And it's pretty clearly the shape, and the notes are there embedded in the thing. It's not, they don't exactly leap out at you. So let's see. And this is the one. These numbers actually correspond to the various sides of the pyramid, and sometimes he traces various paths through them. This actually, a friend of mine who was an art historian pointed out that this is a kind of basically a symbol for Maria Assumpta, which, as you may know, Max shared a birthday with the Virgin Mary, and this comes up in various situations, such as, I think it comes up in the Jungle of Notre Dame. So that now what the backward Z and the 4 and the E have to do with anything, I'm not quite sure, but and as I say once again, I can't find anywhere in the score this exact sequence, although I'm perfectly willing to believe that it's buried somewhere in there. If I spent more time, maybe I could find it. There's another sequence of numbers and notes, which clearly, okay. The other thing that I thought was interesting is I got to looking at the harp part that supposedly is the bull Pavan, and I was a little surprised. You can hardly make any correlation between the bull and the harp part. So once again, I pasted. This is the bull as given in the Fitzwilliam Virginal book, and this is the harp part. And there's a kind of vague resemblance, but the thing that was striking to me is that all of the parts of the Pavan that are distinctive have been taken out. So you get a kind of general G majorish, dominant tonic kind of thing, with these funny sharps, which are supposed to, and unfortunately, I never looked closely enough at it to ask Max about it at the time. Okay, going on. The symphony sketches are, as far as I know, Chris Austin has them now. I got them from Chris. So the thing that was striking to me, this is the first thing that's there. And the thing that was immediately striking to me was that this magic square is not the usual magic square. Once again, so well, the other interesting thing is, okay, we're in the talking section now. So the magic squares, Max got them apparently from Gillian Whitehead, and he found them and referred other people to them in a book by John Mitchell called The View Over Atlantis. I think it's actually kind of interesting that the long chapter before Mitchell talks about magic squares, he talks about the Great Pyramid and he talks about the significance of pyramids, making me wonder if Max maybe had some, maybe Gillian was kind of the spark about his connecting the magic squares to his music, but he was kind of fishing for that kind of resemblance, that kind of organization of things anyway. It's interesting that in the pre-magic square pieces, there are all these things that are derived from various kind of practices. There are things from change ringing. There are things from what Max knew about Indian classical music and theory, and they're kind of there coexisting. I think the thing that was interesting and useful for Max about magic squares is that he was able to put all those things together in one kind of rubric. One thing, and I forgot to look up the quote, but there's a quote in David Roberts' dissertation where he's talking about too many is a well, and he actually there are one or two kind of powerful negative places in that dissertation. I think it's interesting, and one of them is he basically says by the time all these operations are done, where is the resemblance to the original material? Which is possibly some question or possibly not. But at any rate, just to go the background on the magic squares, the magic squares that Max usually used are from the Mitchell book, and magic squares started in China and they moved west, and the Europeans kind of ran across them in the Crusades, and the Europeans were the ones who decided to describe them as magic, and presumably it was the Europeans who connected each of the magic squares with one of the Ptolemaic planets, so that 9 is the moon, 8 is Mercury, 6 is the sun, 7 is Venus, 5 is Mars, 4 and 3 I forget. 3 is Saturn or 3 Jupiter. 3 is Jupiter and then 4 is Saturn. 3 and 4 are, from my experience, kind of not very useful, whereas the others are. The other thing that makes me, I mean, I'm not sure how much Max, I'm pretty sure he didn't know much about magic squares at the beginning, nor did he need to know much about magic squares. They served his purpose and that was fine. But in terms of I remember at Dartington one summer, Max said that there were no magic squares of an order more than 10, which is not at all correct. And I think what happened is over the years, I mean, Philip Grange told me they organized something for Max's, I think, 70th birthday at the University of Manchester. And they had a mathematician there who was an expert on magic squares do a lecture on magic squares. So eventually these things came Max's way and he kind of assimilated them in various ways. I remember running across at some point a article in the Journal of World Religions that talked about the difference in construction between Islamic magic squares and Hindu magic squares. Islamic magic squares all start with one in the middle, and Hindu magic squares are crisscrossed. And so, at any rate, the point of this is, it was striking to me that when I saw the magic square that's in this sketch, it's not the square of the moon. This is the square of the moon from the Mitchell. This is the one that Max used. Now, I know practically nothing about magic squares, and I tried to kind of ask people I knew who thought might know something about it. But the thing that's striking to me about this square and possibly the connection of this piece is that this square is kind of in a knight's move construction. So you get 1, 2, 3, but then it goes a little crazy. 5, 6, and then 7 is there into 8, but then 7 is kind of from 9, and from 9 is from 4. So it's a knight's move construction, but it's all jumbled up. And there is, you can make it with the knight's move where it's consistent. And I have my suspicion is, in thinking about why he might want to do that, is that it's and this is another thing that the end of Roberts's dissertation, he is kind of suspicious of magic squares, and he says, well, they're not really magic, and you can't, something like that. But and my feeling is that for Max they were iconographic, in the same way that what a lion shows up in a Renaissance painting, and you're supposed to think of St. Jerome, I think. So the squares are kind of symbolic of something. And in Image, Reflection, Shadow, which is dedicated to Charles Senior, who was an Orcadian poet who Max knew, the plain song material that he used for the piece is derived from Lux Aeterna. So if you think it's an in memoriam piece, you're using Lux Aeterna, then you'd probably use the square of the sun, which is 6, which is what he used. So all of these things fall in a kind of way that's, as I say, iconographic. And I have a feeling, without any particular proof of it, that was what Max was about here somehow, that it had to do with his protest of the Iraq War. The other thing that was striking to me is that there's not a lot of, well, this seems to be where he worked out the notes. The thing that's interesting about it, he has these 3 series of 5 notes, and you notice that one term that David Roberts uses is first-time sieving. The way that Max would approach the plainsong material is he would take the notes of the plainsong and just leave out the notes that were repetitions. And so he's doing that here. And he ends up with this series of notes. Which is right here. The other thing that's striking to me about, the sketch material that I've looked at in pieces involving magic squares is basically Image, Reflection, Shadow, and the 3rd Naxos Quartet. So I haven't looked at, for instance, Ave Maristella. I don't think he divided the 9 notes into groups of 3 in Ave Maristella, which he's clearly doing here. And my suspicion is I had a lot of trouble finding any connection between the series of magic squares and any of the notes of the piece. And my suspicion is that he decided to kind of fragment them and do groups of threes. Now, this is the sketch of the first, and this is the trombone part, which is almost almost these notes, except when you when you get to what should be an A flat, it's an A natural. It's not too worrisome because, after all, if you're a composer and you're coming along to a place and a note doesn't work, you just use the right note. And Max says it in his notes. He says the introduction has all the material of the piece, and I think it's interesting that he let's see, where is that all the material of the piece is this kind of. Now, just to another basic thing about magic squares, the way they generally work is that you take your note, and then you do like a 12-tone matrix. You put the note down the side and you transpose everything starting with the first note, and that's fine. When you feed it into an odd number magic square, you get completely symmetrical notes, and I found that a little bit of a problem, and I talked to Max about it one time, and I think the solution that he had at that time was once he got this matrix, he would rotate them. So the second line would start with much like Stravinsky does, and that would mean that you'd end up with a magic square that didn't have that symmetrical repetition. The thing that's interesting about these sketches is that he has another approach. This is a very jumbled square. For one thing, if you first look at the matrix, it looks like some kind of scale. I think the idea, once again, if you divide it up into threes, there's a kind of pattern there with a half step and then another interval. But when you try to figure out this, it's well, first of all, it's practically illegible. I mean, for his purposes, it was fine because he knew what he was doing. So I transcribed them. This is the matrix, and this is. So that's the other thing. I just when you get to 10, 10 becomes 2-1. So everything is there are two numbers associated with each number, the number of the row and the number of the order in the row. And Max was able to use those primarily for determining rhythms early on. I think he branched out. So this is what would be the usual form of the matrix that he would do. So the real number in this bottom line and the as it were mod 9 number for everything is there, and these are the notes you get. And now you notice that in this case the notes are not symmetrical. However, if you look at the second line and the last line, you see they're the same notes. So the kind there's another effect of the thing that you get from the symmetrical things. In this case, and I noticed there are a number of things where Max does this. He added the inversion. But he didn't fool with the notes that were repetitions of the lines. So in this square, you get it in this forest. You get the square numbers, but you also get the inversions of so that, for instance, you start with F and you go up to A and you go down to D flat and then you go up to B flat and you go to C. so on and so forth. Now, the other thing that happens in these, this is another 9-square matrix, but let's see, there it is. Okay, the left is a 9-square matrix, and the right is a 7 matrix. But if you notice, they're the same, except he left out the repeated notes. Another thing that he does in these sketches is that he simply just leaves out the part that's symmetrical, and you just, so that if you've got a 7-square and you get this symmetry, he just leaves out the last 3 notes. And then now this is okay. This is actually in the short score. You notice that the end of page 2. I'm jumping around a little bit. It says the end of page 2. It says pages 3 and 4 see pages 45 and 46. So that literally in the short score, page 3 and page 45 are the same, and page 4 and 46. Now, it doesn't work out quite that way in the realized orchestra score. So let's see. I think that's all I got about that. I mean, there are details of various kinds, but so. So at the beginning of a conclusion. St. Thomas Wake was one of the first pieces of Max that I got to know when I heard him talk about it and play a recording of it at Tanglewood in 1973. Shortly after that, almost immediately after I moved to England for 2 years, sort of to study with Max, I heard him conduct a performance of it in the festival hall. I don't remember with which orchestra. I only remember that the concert also included a performance of the Grieg Piano Concerto with John Will as the soloist. Before that, there was a rehearsal which I went to at Cecil Sharp House, which was I mean, the name Cecil Sharp was incredibly evocative for me. So it has been in and on my mind for a long time. I first heard the Ninth Symphony on the Proms in 2012, which was the year that it was first played. I immediately was struck by the at least surface similarity between the two pieces. Max was there, and when I mentioned my thoughts about it to him, he seemed a little irritated and said the two pieces were completely different. Since the contrast and similarity of the two pieces has been on my mind, I set out to look at that for this event, which you may recall was initially supposed to happen 19 months ago. I can't actually claim to have spent all those 19 months looking very carefully at the scores, but my thought was that Max's pronouncement about the pieces were at the very least demonstrative of the differences between the procedures and the mindset of the 35-year-old composer and the 78-year-old that he became. But also it seemed to me that it said something about the way the world, or at least a lot of the composers in the world, thought in 1969 and in 2012. It seemed to me that in 1969 it was important to serious composers that their work was carefully organized and that the content of those works should be organic and at some basic level unified, despite whatever surface differences there might be. By 2012, all those concerns seemed unimportant, and putting completely unrelated material side by side in the same piece was no big deal. I trying to kind of organize my thoughts about this, I started talking to other people about it, and I was talking to the composer Michael Pizarro, who pointed out that, once you have sampling, the idea kind of changes about, how much. It also struck me that in a way, you could say, well, this is all collage, and then I was thinking, the idea about collage and music didn't really show up until about the end of the 60s, about the time of St. Thomas Wake. I mean, the first piece that I can think of that was a kind of big major scale collage was the Barrio Symphonia. I'm happy to stand corrected about that if anybody has. But anyway, so music was a little behind art because, of course, visual arts had been doing collages for 40 years by that time. Now, and this is the point where I hope we'll we'll get into a discussion because the other thing that strikes me is the idea of parody. To a certain extent, it comes up in terms of the Foxtrots in St. Thomas Wake. At that point in Max's career, they had a kind of sharpness about them. And he actually says in St. Thomas Wake, it's one dead dance form commenting on another dead dance form. And I was wondering, by the time you get to the Ninth Symphony, the other thing I didn't say about the Ninth Symphony is that the way the small ensemble is treated is completely different. The brass sextet comes in at a point playing this kind of dumb music, which is kind of march-like, but it's always completely surrounded by the orchestra. And in fact, the music that it plays is kind of doubled and amplified by the orchestra. And that's very different from St. Thomas Wake, where the Foxtrot band is always a separate unit. And when the orchestra and the Foxtrot band play at the same time, the music is clearly different. So I was also wondering that, and by the time Max wrote the Ninth Symphony, he'd been living in Orkney quite a while, and he'd been writing music which he meant seriously, I think, and without irony, as being kind of Scottish sounding. And I wonder if the whole idea of parody was kind of wiped away by that time. And I don't mean to belittle any of those pieces, but once I wonder, once you write, I don't know what, Songs of Hoy, which is a piece that I really like, or if you write Farewell to Stromness, or you write Orkney Wedding and Sunrise, those are all, there's very little irony in those pieces. The music is the music that's supposed to be part of the community, and that's fine. But it just seems to me that the kind of frisson that he had in St. Thomas Wake was just not exactly there in the Ninth Symphony. And once again, I'm not meaning that in any judgmental way. It's just an observation. So, anybody have any thoughts? That's kind of all I've got.
Any questions? Any comments?
Yes.
Well, I mean, in more of a general nature. We're coming back to the pyramids this afternoon. You'll be surprised. Jimmy Whitehead actually has written about it's in a journal called Canzona, which is published by the New Zealand Composers Association in 2004. And she actually explains where she got the idea from and so on. But the interesting thing that I actually wanted to point to was that I'm going to talk about it this afternoon, about how that actually developed from the Mitchell. There's more in the Mitchell, I think, than we might think. It's the alchemy that Max got really interested in. The other thing was, you talked about groups of three. Well, there's an entry in the diary dating to 1974. The diary starts again in 1973-74, having had a 12-year break. And it's I've got the entry here, you might be interested in it. Had a little Schoenberg tribute for our QAH September concert. It's called Zur Heimat. It's actually Zur Heimat nach Bergamo in its actual title. It says Heimat. Where to? Corny, but it happened out of the notes. Also, it's another 3x3 structure with the last large two elided. So I thought, given that you were talking about the threes, this is pre-Magic Square, just.
Yes.
And in his alphabet, he often calls things not recapitulation, but reprise. So you often find that in his alphabet. He also he uses the word development, but he always uses Durchführung, the German for it as well. So it's almost an affectation.
Yeah, well, it's also one of the things that comes up a lot early on is he'll say this is like a sonata form, but it's not really a sonata form because it doesn't really have a development. It doesn't deal with development. It deals with transformation. And there's actually, as I recall, an interesting article that Hans Keller wrote in Tempo about that.
Any questions, comments? Please ask.
Thank you for that. One of the sort of tricky expressions that Max used about a lot of early pieces is when he says something is based on, and that for me is always problematic. And that has always involved, I think, it's always involved a lot of interpretation on the part of commentators as to what that means. In some cases, based on will mean demonstrably, strictly derived from, and in other cases, it means, from when I was looking at earlier music, it means in some, sometimes quite tangentially remote way,
Yes.
conceptually related to the idea of, based on, it just covers such a multitude. So I mean, just make that concrete. I sort of maintain the word of Bliss and Symphony are essentially reworkings of, to a large extent, of the same material. And the new material in St. Magnus is demonstrably based on the irregular plain chant. And the actual 12th century in St. Magnus is just stuff I'm not beginning. Because they can't both be from the same thing. And in World is Bliss, it's more complicated. And there's the idea from the text, because there are three texts, three texting sources for sets that play out in World is Bliss, which relate as World Heaven, if you like, but not in a way that you would show that the set material was actually derived from the melody of the World is Bliss monody. So, in the case of St. Thomas Weiss, I'm very sceptical that it has anything to do with John Paul. It's interesting in the sketches that piece, folded in with the sketches, is the medieval carol St. Thomas on a Wing.
Mm.
And if I were looking, I also can't make any sense of how interesting this is.
What a relief.
But if I were looking for it, I would go to that and think that the John Willis stuck on at the beginning, stuck on at the end.
Well, it's also...
And if he says it's based on, then there is a conceptual sort of notion that there's this idea of let's write music that's got something to do with St. Thomas. And it may go no further than that.
Yeah, it's also interesting that in those early pieces, he was kind of able to, this is putting it really cynically, he was able to have his cake and eat it too. Because he didn't want to write 12-tone music, but he was writing something that could be presented as something equivalent, but derived not from Schoenberg, but derived from medieval music, and therefore he could do whatever the hell he wanted to do, and nobody would bother him.
There is another St. Thomas that's important to him. St. Thomas Aquinas.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So it's just that phrase based on, and I just sort of think that what is problematic sort of from a psychological point of view is that when the composer speaks, he can never be wrong. So Maxwell here, he said, my piece is based on
Yes.
St. Thomas Weiss,
Well, of course, but
World is Bliss, or the hymn of St. Magnus.
yeah.
Then he knows what he means by it, and what becomes problematic is when people subsequently try to demonstrate
Yeah.
what that
Well, he
may not mean.
he also went way out of his way to say that St. Thomas Wake was connected to the bull. He says, it's the bull, the different things are putting it through like a mirror with convex and and he says he said it through a series of mathematical curves, and so it's a little more than
the curves are there.
Yeah.
In the sketches.
Yeah. But it's not. I think St. Thomas Wake he did. It's a little more than he was an innocent bystander with people kind of constructing it. He actually made a deal out of it.
Yes, but I mean, he
Well,
would
he
also
could say whatever he wanted to,
He
but
would also say,
yeah.
the world is bliss, crystallizes audibly at the end of it. Well, the handbells come in, chiming in, with all sorts of wrong notes, actually. and it's a very poetic way of discussing something which is tricky to relate to some very technical processes that you can see going on in other pieces.
Can I thank you for
Sure.
your presentation? We ought to have a break before the next session, so can we call that?
Okay, so welcome back to our second session, and we've got two papers in this session, and I'd like to introduce you to Alexander Kolassa. Alex is currently a lecturer in music at the Open University. He undertook his PhD in composition at the University of Nottingham, and then worked on research projects at the University College London and Cambridge University. So his research concerns the intersections of musical modernism, medievalism and popular culture in the concert hall, on stage, but also on the screen. He has co-edited the collection Recomposing the Past for Routledge and contributed to that publication work on British contemporary opera. He has also published articles and chapters on sound and music in film, television and video games, as well as on new developments in immersive new media. So today you're going to be talking about The Devils, which I am absolutely looking forward to. Such a great film. Thank you so much, Alex.
Brilliant. I'm just going to jump straight into it. So, where are we? There we are. A crazy clutter of the medieval medical mind. Thus reads film director Ken Russell's script for a scene occurring roughly halfway through his 1971 cult film, The Devils. Do I just click here? Yeah. It goes on. Horses' hooves, human bones, the fetus of a whale, retorts, jars, and dominating everything, the suspended crocodile under which evidence against Grandier is being discussed. The room's strange, even comic combination of medievalised artefacts is something of a metaphor for the devils, but also for a more general and pervasive kind of historical imaginary or presence that's prevalent across film, television, music, and more media besides. For reasons that I hope will become clear, I call this medievalism. Well, whilst often engaged with what it means to be historically informed, medievalism is frequently, if not uniformly, marked by contradiction and anachronism. It is at authenticity's limits that the creative past most effectively speaks to the present. And in a conference on rethinking, unmasking the composer Peter Maxwell Davies, a composer for whom medievalism is an active descriptor, this could be elevated to a kind of maxim, no pun intended. Davies composed the score for The Devils. The score is every bit as incongruous as that scene. This paper then proposes a couple of modest things. In the limited time I have, we'll look at some of the music for the film, which I've explored in his written manuscripts and sketches, which are held at the British Library. And we'll also consider Davies's collaboration with Ken Russell here, as well as concurrent collaborations with the early music populariser David Munro. But I'll also do this through the discursive lens of medievalism, an interdisciplinary perspective that considers the polyvalent living past in the contemporary imagination. One that, in considering his appropriation of early music, as well as other things, casts Peter Maxwell Davies in a new light, perhaps as someone popular, certainly as someone communicating in a language that has a broad appeal and relevance for diverse audiences today. So I've said this word medievalism a couple of times now. What is it? Medievalism refers simply to the use of the Middle Ages in modern culture, writ large. Everything from the novels of Walter Scott to the giant transmedia franchise Game of Thrones. A recognition of the creative use and currency of the distant past in the present breaks down, I'd argue, the rigid distinction between so-called high and low brows, but we'll come back to that in a minute. The term's emergence in the 19th century ensures that it's closely related to the development of the so-called science, the objective study of medievalist studies. History and pure creation, study and enjoyment, are rarely so mixed as in the modern reception of the Middle Ages. In this country, it's a sort of invented tradition in the Hobsbawmian sense. And industrial Britain, as much, probably more than anywhere else, negotiates its future for its past through myths of continuity. Indeed, the Middle Ages itself, as Maxwell knew, for all its religiosity, maintained a complex relationship with teleology. And it's interesting to consider how this idea might leak into the reception of supposedly teleological modern works. That's a big subject, of course, but consider only the Wheel of Fortune literary motif, which supposes a passing of time that was, by contrast, cyclical, capricious and prone to bouts of inexplicable cruelty. The same Wheel of Fortune that dominated Taverner's Royal Opera House premiere stage in 1971. There's a picture of it there. So just to summarise the literature of medievalism here and what I think it offers the study of contemporary music, it urges novel insights from its emphasis on co-temporality, for understanding the juxtaposition of the discovered and the wholly made and new, and its complicating of rigid distinctions in medieval-inspired artworks between the intellectual and the popular. In light of a post-1960s, postmodern, shall we say, collapse in meta-narrative, there's something in the imaginative leaps in time encouraged by medievalism that emphasises, if nothing else, the co-presence of past and present, or the possibility for competing experiences of time. Medievalism encourages a diversity of thought in terms of history and temporality, one that chisels away modernity's temporal monolith in the spirit of a playfulness that's both ancient and contemporary, if not wholly out of time. Should be fairly obvious how that resonates, I think, with the work of Peter Maxwell Davies. And a brief note, when I said medievalism, it really allies the Middle Ages with adjacent time periods, right? Because the distinction between, say, the Middle Ages and the Renaissance is historiographically sort of fuzzy anyway. So the thing to keep in mind is a sense of historical difference and historical otherness. But keep that in mind, because we'll move to Ken Russell now. I'm sure you're all familiar with his work, but I'll give you a summary anyway. In the 1950s and 60s, Ken Russell made a name for himself as a director of artsy films and documentaries for the BBC. He'd find mainstream international success in the 1970s, and in the 80s and 90s, he produced a string of erotic box office failures. He's mostly well known, actually, for a number of highly stylised composer biographies, so this is where musicologists tend to know of him best. All this will give you, at least in passing, an idea of his output. A somewhat eclectic character, he vacillated uncomfortably between a critical darling and a schlocky pornographer. As a British auteur, filmmaker, he has at times been dismissed as the wrong kind of auteur. Someone that Christopher Van Eyck summarises as making sort of inferior or meretricious work. But more recently, he's been rehabilitated. These things do tend to come around. As an important director of a distinctly British species of modern cinema. Kevin Flanagan and other scholars have repurposed his erratic pop art style and argued that it represents a species of late artistic mannerism or cinemannerism. Which is, of course, a reference to the Renaissance art movement. For Flanagan, his, quote, personal and hybrid approach to conventions like the biographical film, say, straddled the narrative mainstream and the conceptual avant-garde, and, quote, does so with eclectic, complex structuring and stylistic elements. So this, along with the fact that he has an interest in depicting historical subject matter, makes him, I suppose, a pretty obvious Davies collaborator. So I don't know what the general awareness of their relationship is among you all, sort of reasonably well known, but I'd say it's not really talked about very much, and if it is, the relationship between Ken Russell and Peter Maxwell Davies and their collaboration is usually brushed over, or it's certainly kind of touched upon only slightly. So to generalise that somewhat, the Ken Russell literature, in the Ken Russell literature, Peter Maxwell Davies is only ever really mentioned in a kind of cursory way, so perhaps it's a kind of prestige thing that Russell scored himself a serious composer. In the Davies literature, and perhaps because Max himself seemed to distance himself from it, the collaboration is downplayed a little bit. So that old Mike Seabrook documentary even just calls it a diversion from more serious things. The Devil's score's main interest arises from the fact it was the first thing Max composed in Orkney. And he did so in record time as well, I think a week or a couple of weeks. Nevertheless, they had, for 1 year, a rather extensive collaboration, and this represents an interesting what-if scenario in the history of British music and film, for me at least. So, in 1970, Russell was a very public rising star, and he clearly saw some affinity with Max and his music theatre works especially, and he financed 2 Fires of London releases on Unicorn Records in a dedicated Ken Russell series. Max in turn composed 2 film scores, his only proper film scores for Russell. Again, all in 1970. He wrote arrangements and foxtrots for the musical adaptation The Boyfriend, and then he scored, as we'll see, The Devils with the Fires of London. Simultaneously, Russell was scheduled to direct the Royal Opera House premiere performance of Taverner, and that got quite far along. It fell apart. Russell obviously wasn't involved in the end. And there are some documents being catalogued at the British Library right now which sort of deal a little bit with that collaboration. So I think there's more work to be done. There are some contradictory accounts of what went wrong, but I gather that Russell heard a tape recording of Max playing Taverner in piano reduction, and Russell thought he couldn't work with it. And for all his reputation as a kind of muckraking, radical director at the time, I think he had very conservative musical tastes, which you kind of could gather from his filmography. The split seemed somewhat acrimonious, actually. Davies was all set at this point to do another Russell film score, what became 1972's Savage Messiah, and that never happened. So, Taverner and the Devils. In 1971, or in a 1971 documentary about the making of the Devils, called Director of the Devils, Russell can be heard bragging in the back of a car, he's driving to a film set, about his work with Max and about their artistic affinities, and about his forthcoming opera directorial debut. He's particularly buoyant at this point about their collaboration, and of Taverner he describes it as being, on a religious subject matter, very similar to the Devils. It's about corruption of religion, he says, the corruption of a human being, and when the forces of religion get to work on him. It's a very pompous interview. And then he says, so when it came around to finding a composer for this film, there was only really one possible choice. The similarities then, I think, are self-evident. Both Taverner and the Devils revolve around a rebellious religious figure, that figure's transformation, the relationship that figure has to structures of religious authority, and both culminate in, spoiler alert, executions of that character. Sonically, both are characterised by a Peter Maxwell Davies at his most expressionistic, but equally crucial is the jarring encounter in both instances of Max's modernism with that of a stylised, very 1970s sort of early music. You know the kind I mean, shawms, usually. In Taverner, that's best represented, of course, not simply by the plain song underpinning and the in nomine quotation that it ends with, but by those newly composed period pastiche instrument sections, such as this one from near the beginning of the second act, which in the original Royal Opera House performance featured David Munro and his ensemble, the Early Music Consort of London. And they played as a sort of offstage band, but I suppose it's diegetic in the context of the opera. David Munro and the Early Music Consort are also in The Devils. They play so-called period-appropriate diegetic music, which weaves, for the length of the film, in and out of Max's non-diegetic score. It's Renaissance-era stuff mainly, including works by Michael Pretorius, Claude Gervais, as well as several scenes of unison plain chant. So I want to look at the score itself now. I've talked enough about the context. And throughout, you'll see early music plays a characteristically strong role. I'll walk you through the film's first, roughly noisy 15 minutes. If I'd say something about the score in advance, it's that it's clear it was written in about a week. But because it's so rough and ready, I think you do get Max at his most raw. The whole score is full of excess. It's quite improvisatory. It seems like it's sort of falling apart, which to me is a sort of quality of its medievalism, actually, and I think makes its study all the more rewarding. So the film begins not with Max's music, but with a very camp stage performance by France's King Louis XIII. And it's accompanied by Munro's jaunty early music, playing passages from Pretorius's Terpsichore suite. So there's that Bourrée piece, which was a kind of very well-known example of early music at the time. Anyway, the king approaches the bad guy, Cardinal Richelieu, and he says Amen, which is the cue for the start of the music, and you can see that on the score here. The music at this point is characterised by, it says on it somewhere, sultry over the alto flute, by a kind of meandering, sultry flute melody, which kind of goes along dodecaphonically between cuts in dialogue, between the king and the cardinal there, until it comes to rest on a barely audible but undeniable version of the famous Dies Irae plain chant. Yada, 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 you know the one. And that aligns roughly with a tam-tam accompanied cut to an outside shot, you see it here, of a maggot-infested corpse's face. It's a very bold way to start a film, I think. From this scene, we find ourselves in medieval city walls, the French medieval city of Loudun, where Oliver Reed's Grandier character is leading a citywide funeral. For the next few minutes, that same Dies Irae chant is heard to accompany a procession, and you even get to see some sort of period-appropriate musical instruments here, including the serpent and the sakpa. But the Dies Irae repeats. It's maddening in its insistence. It's sort of deconstructive to my ears. Vanessa Redgrave's sister Jeanne character, she's important because her sexual obsession with Grandier becomes the catalyst for the crazy things that happen in this film. And she can be seen watching the events from her convent, and she begins to hallucinate. This passage starts there. It's sort of freely, indeterminately notated, somewhat in the style of a kind of Penderecki or something like that. And it's heard, I think by design, to be heard in conjunction with this sort of diegetic, distant Dies Irae, where the latter, the Dies Irae, effectively dissolves into this. And you can see a cue there, first sight of Grandier and stuff like that. As you can see, it's mostly a dialogue between the alto flute again and a harsh sword-pont cello part, which, if you look closely, is the Dies Irae chant again, but it's displaced by octaves. The scene, anyway, escalates, as this film could be described to do more generally. Jeanne sees Grandier as a crucified Jesus. He walks toward her on water. And then she turns into a bit of a nightmare for her. Her character has scoliosis of the spine, so this kind of returns and she sort of freaks out. The music sort of follows that. You get this sort of percussive processional with the with plain chant type sort of melody in the alto flute, which climaxes with this racket, which is great. So I'm struck that Davies considers this scene in strongly compositional terms, and the manuscript will show him timing cuts quite meticulously and labelling sections intro, A, B, coda. You get the idea. So you get lots of little diagrams like this, basically. There's one such diagram for the next scene, which I don't have a picture of, I'm afraid, but that's the next scene I'm going to look at. And it has a similar structure, but it's organised according to the logic, at least in part, of an isorhythmic motet. Isorhythm being a medieval composition technique for ordering time, here used effectively to structure filmic time too. So the scene that follows, called the plague scene in the manuscript, is a pivotal moment in the narrative. Grandier walks through plague-ridden streets at night. Calls of "bring out your dead" are soon to be parodied by Monty Python, and he interrupts some alchemists during their crackpot attempt to cure a dying woman. It's this point he meets Madeleine de Brou, with whom he has an affair, and it's this affair that drives Sister Jeanne mad, and that escalates into sort of orgies of nuns and exorcisms and executions. So you can see this on the first page of this. So you get at the beginning this leitmotivic chord at the beginning, which I suppose is the death chord, right, that we talked about earlier, and that occurs throughout the film. And then you get the flute, which there you are, and then you get the flute plays a dance of death, which is an indeterminate speedy tour through the Dies Irae again, but it sort of runs off up the octave. And then, accompanied by a melange of improvisatory percussive organ and other instrumental sounds, you get the start of this multi-part isorhythmic composition, which is written in two voices, and it's labelled here for the trumpet and the cello, which is to say, both lines, again, are derived from the Dies Irae chant, but displays by the octave with the top voice inverted. Instead of going down, it goes up. Moreover, as with the isorhythm, they're composed according to a pre-composed rhythmic scheme, which repeats in sections of this scene. You know, in the jargon of early music, this would be called a talaia, so you can see the two talaias that cover this scene here. In addition to that, both voices are rhythmically related as in a prolation canon. This is another medieval technique that Max uses, especially earlier in his career. It's sort of evidenced in some of the green and red pen marks there, but you can see it more clearly in the top right. That is to say, the lower voice, a slow-moving cantus firmus, which aligns with Talia 1 here, unfolds at a certain speed, and then the top voice does so at 3 times the speed. So a dotted minim becomes a crotchet, and a dotted crotchet a quaver. Now, I'm sort of going to speed through this a bit now, but you can see my tabular analysis here. And I think it's interesting how the kind of expressionistic musical idiom, the film, and this kind of medieval thing are all kind of synthesizing here. And I'm using up my time, but suffice it to say, similar techniques are used in the film's climactic scenes, the execution. And though I focused mostly on the use of the Deus Irae chant here, there's also much use of the Ave Maria chant, as in this melody here, da, 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 da. And you get that in Foxtrot several times throughout the film. Here's the bits of that. And this curious little passage, which in the manuscripts indicates a kind of late-stage brief. So I suppose Ken Russell asks for a, quote, piece of music in full Hollywood treatment, a syrupy hymn sung by a celestial choir with harps. So you get the Ave Maria melody there, but with these kind of cheesy rising diminished chords. But you can ask me about that in the questions if you're interested, because I'm going to move on to my conclusion. So it's striking that Russell and his crew boasted about the historical veracity of the film on all possible occasions. The film, in fact, was marketed in the USA with the following. You can see this. The Devils is not a film for everyone. Interesting promotional decision there. It's a true story, carefully documented, historically accurate by a serious director. The defensive tone is interesting for a number of reasons. There's a whole history of censorship attached to the Devils, and preemptively, this idea of authenticity is being leveraged into that politics of censorship. Is historical veracity, I wonder, expected here to mitigate the film's immoral or pornographic excesses, or does it in fact facilitate them? The film might disturb you, but at least it does so authentically. Authenticity, though, is a term with a contradictory core, and the collision between Davies's theatrical expressionism and early music, the combination of which is a very visceral medievalism, explodes that. What is really authentic here? Ken Russell and Peter Maxwell Davies, then, are staging something of a dramatisation of the transgressive politics of authenticity in The Devils. And in this way, Russell's cinematic vision affords us a more nuanced second look at Davies's usually treated ironical take on the musical materials of the period in light of the fashions of the time. Indeed, connected with Dovetail 2 Max's score, the early too modern sonic continuum becomes something of a snake eating its own tails in The Devil, eating its own tail rather in The Devils. All the same, the discontinuities of musical time create opportunities, as in conjunction with Russell's mannerist style, for the viewer or listener to locate new types of transgressive meaning that are neither here nor there, past nor present, Davies nor Monroe. A better understanding of Max's modern medievalism, then, can illuminate much about the role that the past, popular and otherwise, plays in the work of many forward-thinking composers. In part, this has been problematic because serious-minded composers of new music tend to distract and focus their discussion on the more technical, recondite aspects of their craft, and form a picture of what influence the past might have on their work through that lens. Indeed, it's something of a theme in Davies's own writings on the subject that, for all the colour, excess, fun, and absurdity of his musical medieval personality, when prompted to discuss the subject, the tone becomes a little drier. In turn, such perspectives have coloured our latter-day reception of the legacies of musical modernism. The Devil's crass excessive score, then, is suggestive of a crack in the carefully crafted modernist edifice, one that articulates the transgressive and communicative power of Davies, and by association British music since the war's medievalism, in the context of a broader current in challenging and popular medievalist artwork more generally. The score for The Devils, rough around the edges and largely dismissed, packs Max's medievalism most cogently and delivered it to mass audiences and eventually into a central place in the cult cinema British imagination. For rethinking or unmasking Max, I think this film is a pretty good place to start. Thank you.
Alex, thank you so much. I mean, there's such richness in that short presentation there. And,
Squeeze it all in, yeah.
Where do we begin? Well, it's a fascinating discussion of work which has not received a lot of attention, quite frankly. So it's absolutely, that's why I'm so looking forward to hearing this. And I know originally this would have been presented 18 months ago at the original, but you've just published a article on this, haven't you, for RMA, is that right?
Yeah. Well, it's being sort of copy edited right now. Yeah, it's so. 3 conferences ago, would have been me trialling these ideas now. Now it's me trying to squeeze 16,000 words worth of journal article into a presentation.
So we can now read the fruits of this research soon.
And if anyone wants it, I can forward it on as well. So.
It's open access.
Yes, secret open access.
You all have to worry about that, I don't. Just one observation, this idea of Max and medievalism. Yes, absolutely. I mean, in my opening remarks, quoted him in that 1991 letter to McGregor, where from 1949 on, the different types of music that was influenced by the medieval concept of the divine and mundane music, you know. So even in 1991, he was thinking about that, and from all of his pieces, I suspect from the Parade from 1949 onwards. So it's deeply intrinsic to everything he wrote in many respects, I should imagine. He was obsessed, wasn't he, with Gothic churches when he was young.
Yeah.
And gargoyles. And he collected gargoyles, apparently, so he said in the 1960s. And there's a story, I think Chris Austin related to me, about Max when he was young. He would visit churches, Gothic churches, and he would take gravestone rubbings. So he was absolutely obsessed with that kind of thing. And this came out of music. You mentioned techniques, didn't you? St. Michael Sonata, trellation, but also you've got the aura of medieval music in many of his pieces. Romantic Mysterium, for example, you can just feel it, can't you?
Yeah, and the Missa L'Homme as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many you can refer to that. So thank you so much for talking about that. You mentioned, here's my question. You mentioned before Ken Russell and Max's relationship with regard to Taverner, and you said that there's quite a lot of material which has just been deposited at the British Library. We've got Chris Scobie here, and maybe Chris, could you just give us a quick update on that material, please?
Almost the very first letters I remember opening when we picked up the letters, they'd been at the Royal Academy of Music for a while.
Yes.
Were these Ken Russell letters that were in these big bright felt tip pens?
Yes, which I've seen, and they're a bit smudged, aren't they?
So currently one of my colleagues, Andrew Patterson's cataloguing the materials of about 55 boxes worth of letters from across his lifetime. And more things have been coming to light over the past few months. We think we should have it all listed sort of by the middle of next year, I'm fairly confident. And then it will just be the process elements to make it available after that. But I know Andrew keeps showing me more things that she uncovers that are absolutely fascinating, really rich collection of letters there.
Can't wait to dive into those. And thank you, Chris, for the update. So I should imagine it's a bit late but this is something you can follow up on, can't you?
Well, I think something about the aborted collaboration between, on Taverner, the opera kind of performance that never happened, is something I want to kind of pick up on. What actually interests me, and I couldn't touch on it here, was that as well as having this kind of trifecta of Peter Maxwell Davies, Ken Russell, and David Munro, there's also Derek Jarman, the director, the well-known director, mostly known in kind of queer cinema. But he's got this. There's a book that came out about 3 years ago called Medieval Modernism and Derek Jarman. So he has this whole thing about the living past as well. And The Devils was the first thing he ever did as a sort of set designer. And he was going to do all the set designs and costumes in Taverner as well. So, there's this sort of interesting confluence, I think, of,
Another article there,
At least, yes. A whole career worth.
Any questions?
I have a question. We still haven't seen a proper version of Devils as it should be. It's still waiting for the proper release. Is it known that with the proper release per se that there might be more music heard? Am I making sense?
Yeah, well, I think there would be. So the scene I was looking at, I think the tabular analysis here that I sort of did, you can actually see, I'd say, mostly cut from the actual film halfway down on the right. So I think when we see an official full version of it, there will be a little bit more music too. For anyone who doesn't know, it was cut terribly, but there was this original X-rated one, and then it got VHS released. It got cut even more, and that was the American cinema cut because the Americans hated it. And then that was the only one you could get. And then now you can get the BFI DVD, which has the original X-rated version, but not the fully uncut version. And then the fully uncut version is sort of available online on archive.com, I think, if you look carefully, and gets the occasional cinema release or like a limited cinema kind of showing. And the observer critic Mark Commode is sort of central in doing that. So, but if anyone gets the DVD, at the end of the director of the Devil's documentary, you see, I think, including bits that were cut from the film, Max and the Fires of London playing in the sound studio to the final scenes of the film. So it's kind of fabulous behind-the-scenes footage.
Very good question for someone who has a lot to learn. How was Tabernacle performed?
So Ralph Coltai directed it, so Ken Russell didn't do it, and then it got done in the end. Oh no, it was Ralph Coltai, the set designer. There was a performance, and then there was a performance a few years back, a concert performance about 15 years ago or something.
There was a second production at Covent Garden.
Yeah, okay.
So the original was 1972.
Yeah.
Then there was a revival
In the 80s, yeah.
And then 82, and then we've got the...
And then Sarah Caldwell did it in Boston.
Okay.
At some point, I can't remember.
Okay.
So there have been, as far as I know, only those three productions.
Yeah. But if you get the NMC CD, it's the concert version that was... Yeah, from 20 years ago, whatever. Yeah.
Striking that the Mad King is sat on Derek Johnny's set. Do you see the cover of the Exams for Mad King?
Oh, yes. What, that one? Yeah. Yes.
It's also striking since Julius Eastman was the first singer. The singer on the first.
It was Julius Eastman on that recording,
Yeah,
so
he's not on that.
yeah. I've just.
That's not Julius.
It's not. No, I've just bought that actually on eBay. That recording. So.
Thank you so much again, Alex.
Thank you.
I'd like to introduce you to Miss... you got this wrong. Could you say it?
Mesbahian.
Thank you. I've been practicing that as well. So Upa completed her master's degree in music at the University of Oxford, and later in 2019 a PhD in music at King's College London. And the title of her PhD thesis, which is excellent in fact, and I recently read it and I urge you to do it, is Maximising Madness in Music, the gift of madness in the music of Peter Maxwell Davies. And the objective of her doctoral research was to provide a comprehensive and nuanced understanding of the musical representations of madness in Max's works, in particular 8 songs from Mad King, Miss Donaldson's Maggot, The Lighthouse and The Medium. So Upa's research over the last few years has been focused on British music theatre, but also musical modernism. And you haven't got the title of your talk at the moment, but as you can see, you'll be talking about The Lighthouse in 1978. Thank you.
Peter Maxwell Davies moved to the Orkney Islands of Scotland in 1974 and lived a solitary life in close proximity to the sea. Soon after his first visit to Orkney in 1970, the sounds of the sea started to appear in his works. The Lighthouse, an opera written 5 years after Davies's relocation, illustrates the strong influence of the sea, both sonically and thematically. The piece is in fact a product of Davies's long-held concern with the topic of madness and his comparatively newer interest in the Orcadian landscape. Discussions around the seminality of the island's culture, however, have overshadowed the significance of madness in the opera. I argue that The Lighthouse interrogates the theme of humans' collective experiences and explores how the same source might cause the simultaneous derangement of a group of people. The piece strives to illustrate that similar circumstances can create shared mental and emotional states. After a brief overview of the piece, I will address the opera's emphasis on what is shared rather than what is individual in 3 sections: multi-rolling, flashbacks, and lighting. The Lighthouse is a chamber opera in a prologue and 1 act with a libretto by Davies himself. Based on a real incident in 1900, the opera sketches out the story of the disappearance of 3 lighthouse keepers and leaves it open-ended, providing no solution to the mystery of their fates. 3 singers play all the roles. Tenor is a keeper named Sandy and first officer, baritone keeper named Blazes, second officer, and bass keeper named Arthur, third officer, and voice of the court. The opera opens with 3 officers testifying in court about their journey to a lighthouse strangely empty of its occupants. They are responding to wordless questions asked by the orchestra's horn, which is placed at the back among the audience. The same 3 men play the final night of the keepers. They also act as narrators and the judge at the beginning and ending of the opera. The main act, The Cry of the Beast, takes place entirely inside the lighthouse. While Sandy and Blazes play a game of crib, Arthur acts as the voice of the court, speaking of chaos, destruction, and a corrupt god. The game does not last long as Sandy accuses Blazes of cheating. This time Arthur, now as one of the keepers, tries to intervene. Realizing that the situation may get completely out of hand, Sandy suggests singing song to change the mood. When the fog gets thick, Arthur starts the foghorn. The keepers grow more distressed by the tempestuous sea. Blazes imagines seeing the ghost of the woman he murdered when he was young. It is implied that Sandy might have committed an indecent act with his sister or a boy at the manse whose spirit has come to take him. Arthur sees the golden calf who has come back to life. The room is filled with spirits. Arthur asserts that they have to kill the beastly animal, and they all plead to God to spare them from his anger and save them from the spirit now seen as the Antichrist. An overwhelming brightness emerges, blinding the audience. In this dazzle, the keepers become the officers, and the beast's eye appear as possibly the lights of the ship. Towards the end, the 3 officers become the relief keepers who were meant to replace the original keepers. As they enter the lighthouse, the opening scene is recreated with the same dialogue. The fact that the opera uses the same set design to represent different places contributes to the converging of the roles into one. We know that the situation at the lighthouse was not ideal for its keepers. They were confined, and there was a great deal of tension between them. Multiple role-playing conveys that adverse conditions can impact a group of people in a similar fashion. This is highlighted most directly by the keepers being collectively affected, but it is also demonstrated when the officers re-enter as a replacement crew and imitate the original keepers. It is as if the relief keepers, the officers, or anyone for that matter, would have reacted in the same way under the same circumstances. Undermining the precision of the roles also extends to the audience member, mainly via the orchestra's horn. By means of questioning the officers, the horn represents a member of the court, and by its position among the audience, it acts as a member of their group. The horn thus dissolves the solid line between audience and court members, and consequently characters and viewers. The instrument further links the audience with the protagonists via one of the characters, namely Arthur. He is the one whose song is accompanied by the horn, and he is in charge of starting the foghorn. By referring to the cry of the beast immediately after sounding the horn, he implies an association between the two. Not long after, he adopts the characteristics of the beast himself. The audience, the horn, Arthur, and the beast thus merge into one. The distinctive qualities that give humans their individuality are pushed to the periphery. In the Lighthouse, flashbacks are used as a psychological tool to disclose the personalities of the characters, mainly through their songs. Hints of mental instability evident in the flashbacks presented in the songs become more perceptible in the protagonist's phantasmic vision at the end. Collective delusion results from the same cause for all 3. guilt complexes rooted in their past. For Sandy and Blaze's, flashbacks come in the form of bygone experiences. Their memories haunt them till the end, making them extremely unsettled. For Arthur, the effect is subtler. He does not speak of an experience or a memory. The insight into his personality and hidden aggression is more symbolic and comes from a reference to the story of the golden calf. In Arthur's story, God is jealous and orders the sons of Levi, who did not worship the golden calf, to slay others who did. The golden calf is also guaranteed to return and destroy all there is. Arthur is not occupied by a personal recollection, but is rather engrossed in an ancient time that he has not experienced firsthand. His hymn is concerned with the general collective past. We are here dealing with collective sin and punishment, symbolizing a personal complex. The choice of Arthur for this symbolism is compelling, as he is the one who has the strongest association with the audience members through the horn. The implied hidden message is that comparable causes could lie beneath the psychoses in all humans. Lighting in this opera is closely tied to the highlights of the story, and most of the dramatic turning points are accompanied by specific lighting states. Ironically, the light of a lighthouse, intended to provide warning and guidance, is used here to create delusion, confusion, and tension. Lighting not only communicates the experience of these moods by the characters, but also induces similar feelings in the audience members. Here I discuss one of the flashing lights to illustrate this point. When Arthur assumes the characteristics of the beast, a triangle of lights representing the eyes of the beast appears. Davies's instructions read, "From afar, the three eyes of the beast approach, ever brighter white and red lights flashing, by the mention of Antichrist becoming an all-blinding dazzle." Excessive light is used to defy the predominant function of light, specifically visibility. The blinding of the audience provides an opportunity for the keepers to become the officers from the commission boat. Presence and absence, as two polar opposites, are merged together. We are not sure who is present and who is not. What happened to the keepers who supposedly left, and from where did the officers emerge? In the build-up to the characters' changing roles, we see the ensemble crescendo to a frenzied climax. The brass growl and slide, the piccolo and clarinet squeak at the top of the ranges, and the strings tremolo dramatically. The bass drum enters, it solemnly keeps time, and is joined with the pianist striking across the bass strings with a drumstick. The whistle blows, the tam-tam strike, and the cymbals ring. The keepers become the officers under the dazzling light, which starts from the mention of the Antichrist and lasts until the roles change. The music is chaotic and frenzied here. When the roles change and the light becomes normal, the piccolo and clarinet enter with a held tone. This tone is then passed on to the cello and the double bass. Then the marimba enters with a pleasing interval of a major third, which is passed on to the guitar. All is calm and order is restored. The glare, the eyes of the beast, is the only time we encounter color light in the opera. It is worth mentioning that studies of light signals discern a difference between visibility and focus. While objects are most easily perceivable with white light, red light attracts the most attention. As a result of its longer wavelength, it also has a tendency to advance in the visual field. And we see it as closer than, for instance, a blue light on the same spot. The beast is thus perceived as being close or moving rapidly towards us, giving rise to panic and angst. Although people's response to the color are varied, general patterns exist among populations. Red light is associated with excitement, stimulation, and aggression. It is in fact the most stimulating color, producing measurable quickening of body functions and provoking a feeling of threat and anxiety. Research indicates that exposure to red light can potentially generate a feeling of being disrupted. Another point to note is that the triangle of lights representing the eyes of the beast become an all-blinding dazzle upon reference to the Antichrist, and it is at this point that the characters' identities change. As Davies specifies, the application of this bright light is to play with reality and illusion and create ambiguity. The question raised is then, which set of characters is real and which set is the illusion. Here, the Antichrist indicates that the viewers might also be tricked. The glare of light obscuring our perception and the mention of Antichrist co-occur, reinforcing ideas of deception and misbelief. Davies explains that a retention of distorted image with near blindness is created, aiming to momentarily confuse vision at a crucial point of misunderstanding in the action. We witnessing the switching of identities might be as delusional as the characters, an impression that does not seem inaccurate considering that the same triangle of lights later becomes the light of the relief ship. How much of this illusion belongs to the keepers or officers, and how much of it belongs to the viewers? What does this dazzling light really represent? Audience and characters collectively share this equivocal state. The preciseness of roles and purpose is destroyed as we cannot be convinced of the nature of the lights. Moreover, one of the officers claimed that he had seen it previously and speculated that it came from a lighthouse. But there was no lighthouse nearby, and the light was out when the three men arrived. This very triangle, specified by the composer to be seen in the sudden calm of the prologue, and for which there are no lighting instructions in the score, goes completely unrecognized by the two other officers. What these lights stand for is vague, and their existence is simultaneously confirmed and denied. They could be pure illusion. The Lighthouse concerns itself with the issue of collectivity from two different but interrelated perspectives. I draw upon Gustave Le Bon's theory of group mentality and Carl Jung's theory of collective unconscious to clarify this focus. Le Bon claims that individuals in a group possess a collective mind. They gain this solely by virtue of being placed in a group. The collective mind projects humans' unconscious foundation, which is similar for all of them, and suppresses their differences, which stem from intellect. The collective mind of a group is not simply the average of the common traits of the people forming that group, but actually displays new characteristics. A group can thus behave, think, and feel in ways quite distinct from its individual members. The group mind in the Lighthouse can be viewed as being in operation at two different levels. First, we have collectivity manifested in different groups. The individual keepers are quite different from each other. In a group setting, though, for instance, when the sea gets upset, they display similar characteristics. We have collective fear and the simultaneous witnessing of a beast. It can also be argued, based on the confusing and contradictory accounts of the officers, that they are collectively lying about what they witnessed at the Lighthouse. Even audience members, taking the role of the judge by their link to the horn, are symbolically shown to collectively reach the same verdict, death by misadventure. Furthermore, all these groups are shown to merge together and form a larger united mentality. The keepers, officers, and relief crew characters are effectively unchanged. The distinction between actors and viewers are also removed mainly by the orchestra's horn. The opera merges all these small groups and dissolves the separating lines that differentiates one from the other. In this way, the piece communicates the interchangeability of these groups' situations and, as a result, the state, emotions, and actions of the members. The other perspective from which the opera approaches collectivity is related to Le Bon's notion of unconscious traits coming to the fore in groups. Jung observes there to be two layers to the human unconscious, one that is derived from personal experience and one that is identical in all humans. He calls the latter collective unconscious and describes it as a universal and impersonal psychic system, the content of which have never been individually acquired, but are inherited. This structure represents the totality of the psyche and consists of archetypes or definite forms which seem to be present always and everywhere. A number of archetypes are detectable in Davies's opera. Rebirth is one example. Though this notion has never been experienced or witnessed, it has existed for the longest of times. Jung provides examples from Greece and Egypt and mentions the story of Christ being twice born. The tradition of assigning a godfather and godmother to newborns is also a byproduct of this ancient belief. In the opera, we directly encounter this archetype in the rise of the golden calf and in the re-emergence of the lighthouse keepers in the end. Arthur is also symbolically reborn from the voice of the cards. The entire story is regenerated at the end when everything is repeated. Davies is generally characterized as a dramatist of the individual. However, around the time of the Lighthouse, he was involved in campaigning against uranium mining in Orkney and had strong environmental concerns. The stylistic objectivity of this piece is also quite distinct from what is described as the intensely personal output of the later 1960s. The libretto is written, according to scholars, with a measure of detachment, which points to its less personal and intimate nature. The composer seems to have been moving away from the personal to the general, the common, the shared. Furthermore, the remote islanders among whom Davies was living have a strong sense of community, mainly as a result of a symbiotic relationship with the sea. There is among them, as Justin Vickers states, a tribal sense of belonging, a desire to protect and provide for one another. Davies felt that the people of Orkney are a tremendous stimulus to work. It is thus not unlikely that the collectivity manifested in their style of living and how they valued life as a group reflected itself in his treatment of madness in this opera. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, again, there's such richness in that, and you know, looking at this opera from those three new perspectives, you know, a multi-rolling flashbacks and lighting. The Lighthouse is a really, I've got a real soft spot for the Lighthouse because that was the first Max piece I ever saw live when I was a master's student here, and they did it in 1994 across at the museum, and Max came and he did a pre-concert talk, and we'd only just been looking at Antichrist, the instrumental work here a couple of days before, and I didn't quite understand it, I can remember. And then I heard the Lighthouse, and it just seemed to click. So I have got the soft spot. And I remember the lighting.
Yeah, it's quite
it is
huge.
blinding, and especially with the motif, you know, the Lighthouse is now all that. I mean, it just has that visceral effect on you, doesn't it? I'll never forget it.
Absolutely, yeah.
So yes, absolutely. My question is, what you touched upon right at the start and also at the end, the central importance of Orkney. So this was written in 1979, you first went there in 1970. This idea of the personal to the general, that shift in his writing that you argue there, connection to the island and the people, the environmental concerns, all of those things. So do you think that this piece would have been the piece that it was if he wrote this somewhere else and he hadn't actually gone to Orkney? How central is Orkney in the construction of this piece?
I think it's actually pretty huge because you can hear the sounds of the sea all throughout the piece. And Davies kind of goes back to this, you know, that he's being a dramatist of the individual in the medium a little bit again. So I think it's kind of in him still. But this definitely would not be, Orkney is huge. Mainly the sounds of the sea, and also to some extent, you know, this famous quote that he was, he had this kind of mapping of the compositions to the daily walks with his dogs. So I think that must have had an effect, yeah.
So it comes out in the composition itself, with Max walking through the landscape and the...
Yeah, and the sounds of the sea especially, you know, the seagulls and
So
and even there is this, Peter Sellers has directed it, and he kind of, I mean, I have never seen it, but he has kind of portrayed the instrumentalists as waves even, so it's like that huge in the, you can completely hear it in music. Yeah.
Thank you. Any questions? Alex?
Much of a question. Was Max into Jungian psychoanalysis? Is that a thing? I suppose lots of people from this generation.
Yes, that's actually a very interesting question. So I'm not trying here to kind of provide like a Jungian analysis of his music, definitely not, or kind of try to say that he intentionally kind of put these archetypes in the music, kind of. But I'm just trying to emphasize the issue of collectivity and how it's reflected in the music. But to answer your question, Max was familiar with Jung. He was familiar since his teenage years, and he also, I think there are references to Jung, particularly with actually the issue of archetypes. He talks about it in an interview with Griffiths, I think. He says that ultimately you feel like your music is an archetype, it's all in you, it's just you're trying to just kind of take it out. And then also in Taverner, I think if I'm not mistaken, and Resurrection, in the libretto, there are like clear direct references to Jung. So it's not that far-fetched, I suppose.
Are you tempted to see Sandy's song when they have the reprise and you get the interweaving of the three verses to get a different spin on the meaning of the don't seem to need to be more Freudian. It's like it slips.
Sorry, in what sense is it Freudian?
It's that things are emerging from the text, which the singer himself is not conscious of.
Oh, right, this Sandy's song where the other two singers kind of like, yeah.
When they do the reprise and the verses in
Yeah, that's kind of, yeah, I suppose. It's part of like also ambiguity of the piece. You don't really know that it's coming from Sandy or coming from the other two as well. So or the way he sings even, it's as if it didn't happen in the past. He's like, I'm transported by your charms, so as if it's happening now. So these are all, examples of kind of ambiguity and like kind of confusion in the piece. It's like kind of, it feels like there is like this big united whole, the details of which are kind of fuzzy. You really don't know what belongs to who.
Any other questions? Well, I think in a similar way, this was a paper that was originally intended, wasn't it, for 18 months ago, and you were taking the opportunity, like Alex, to publish part of this paper in a more extended version anyway. And that's in the
Yeah, it just came out like I think 2 weeks ago.
Yes, so if you are interested to read Luca's article on this, then it is freely available through open access as well.
Yeah, I'd be also happy to send it if anyone is interested.